Now, of course, the tariff threat from Donald Trump comes in the middle of a campaign. So let's bring in our political strategist now, Susan Smith, former Liberal strategist, co-founder and principal of Blue Sky Strategy Group, Cole Hogan, a conservative digital strategist, principal at GT, and George Soule, former director of communications for the NDP. Hello to all three of you.
Hello.
Hello. Listen, I'm going to start with you, Cole, today, because, you know, because Donald Trump interjects into week one of this campaign, you now have Mark Carney being able to speak as Prime Minister, not just Liberal leader, but as Prime Minister dealing with a very substantive issue. How difficult is that for a party, like your party, when essentially the Conservative leader is trying to change the channel away from Carney vis-a-vis Trump?
Yeah, there's no denying that, you know, being able to respond as, you know, Liberal leader right now, but Prime Minister, you do have that like undeniable advantage in that regard, similar to what Doug Ford was able to do during the Ontario election, where, you know, he went down to the States and you're taking action on Trump and tariffs. So that is an advantage. I think what we're seeing Pierre and the Conservatives try to do day after day, you know, the week leading up to the election and the first week of the election so far, it's been a policy every morning, day after day. So I think you know, that's including, you know, some union endorsements, some solid rallies, and, you know, I think Pierre and the Conservatives in Poilievre's address last night struck the right tone of acknowledging the anxieties that auto workers and Canadians are having about these tariffs, and that's a good start to counteract some of the natural advantage that Carney has right now.
Yeah, I wonder, though, you know, how many people are listening to anything but Donald Trump right now, given this existential threat. George, how difficult is it for the NDP right now as they're trying to find space up against Mark Carney? Because we do know in terms of polling numbers, it's having an effect on NDP support.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we saw that big swing, you know, to the Prime Minister and we've kind of all gathered around the flag. And, you know, it's just kind of nice in some ways because it means we can take our flag back from where it's, you know, the protesters from a few years ago. But it definitely is a challenge in this election. And it means really connecting with people. And I think we see some of that. Some of those people that have moved are a bit fluid. So hopefully, you know, a whole month is a long time in a campaign. You know, I keep pointing to the fact that a week before the debates in 2011, before we won 103 seats, we were at 13%. So it can still come. But it's definitely a challenge right now. And you're right. There's not a lot of issues going on. It's all about Trump. And people are worried about what they're going to do with their jobs, how they're going to pay the bills. So as I've been saying, I think still if Jagmeet can find a place to say, look, like it's probably going to be a Liberal government, but you want us in there to keep you honest, and you know, and if not, then maybe even put us in charge. But really kind of swing that emotional connection. I think that's the path that exists for the NDP to come back. But certainly in the same way it is for the Conservatives, we're watching right now. We're sitting here watching Mark Carney be Prime Minister, and so that's what punches through. That's what's going to be on the evening news, and so it's definitely a challenge in this campaign.
Yeah, challenge. Although, you know, Susan, to be fair, Mark Carney and the Liberals must be breathing a bit of a sigh of relief, because until Donald Trump spoke yesterday, the focus yesterday was actually questions about Brookfield, about pension plans that he helped co-manage, registered in Bermuda. How much of a blessing is this for Liberal strategists?
Donald Trump isn't a blessing for anybody, Michael. He's not a blessing for the Canadian economy. He's not a blessing for Canadian jobs. What he has done is rivet the focus of this campaign where it should be, and that's the future of the Canadian economy. That's how do we build resilience in the economy? How do we broaden our trade relationships? Who do we trust as our national security partners? And that's what Mark Carney's been talking about, and that's what he did in his first week as Prime Minister, is address those things. Now he's on the campaign trail. He's paused he's paused the campaign part of things, and he is doing the prime ministerial part of things that you do in a caretaker government, and making sure that this country is ready for whatever Donald Trump is going to throw at us. It's not going to be an overnight solution. It's going to be difficult. Everybody's talked about that. But I think, you know, he was with Canadian auto workers yesterday. I think people are listening, and that's why you see the polling numbers where they are. You talked about Doug Ford and the Ontario polls. The Conservatives are even releasing their internal provincial polls that show that Carney is talking about what Canadians want to be talking about, and the opposition isn't punching through with the things that they want to be talking about.
Okay, so the announcement comes yesterday. The tariffs are meant to come into effect next Wednesday. So at least for this week, if not for the days and the weeks that follow, Donald Trump and the tariffs that come down the pipes is going to dominate the news cycle with or without an election campaign. So how does that change the campaigns, if at all, Cole?
Sure, I think you're going to have to, like, Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives are going to have to respond and talk a little bit more about Trump and tariffs. There's been some stuff that the substance of which has been we need to be less reliant on the Americans in terms of Canadian energy the last 10 years. The Conservatives say haven't been good on the economic front or in terms of getting energy across our own borders internally. So what they'll say now is like, all right, now we need to become less reliant on America, and the fact that 75% of our exports go to one place, we need change, and that needs to happen in order for us to not be in a scenario like this in the future.
There's a challenge for Mr. Poilievre because over a quarter of his base, the people who vote Conservative, like Donald Trump and like Trumpism. And Mr. Poilievre's campaign has largely been built on things that are Trumpist, right? Think about cutting the CBC versus what's happening with NPR. Think about foreign aid. There are so many parallels. So Mr. Poilievre is afraid to let go of that base, yet at the same time, he's got to try and pretend he's Captain Canada when he's been doing anything but for the last 2 years.
George?
That actually that's a huge problem for sure. I mean, no one's going to compare, or at least nobody reasonable would compare Pierre Poilievre and say he is Donald Trump. But it's absolutely true that like a third to a quarter of his base, or a quarter to a third of his base, supports Donald Trump. They just do. And so when they're doing the math, they look and say, well, Mark Carney is moving to the center right and squeezing us over on that side, so we can't give up this far right flank. And so you're watching Pierre Poilievre struggle to keep that language and then not be able to be as strong against the President of the United States, who's right now attacking not only our economy but our sovereignty. So Pierre Poilievre's got to look kind of tough but still play along with his friends. And so that's, I think, where that openness is on the side. While Mark Carney talks about things at a high level, Pierre Poilievre tries to hang on to the far right. Hopefully the NDP can remind folks that we're there with workers. We saw that with Jagmeet today. Over 1 million workers through their unions have supported Jagmeet over just the last week. So hopefully we can find some traction there.
Okay, I do also wonder as to how you campaign for seats and try to knock your opponent while at the same time strike a tone of Team Canada, we're united up against the United States. Is that even possible in the midst of a campaign, Cole?
Sure. I think that there's going to be a few different approaches. Like, I think province by province, we'll see a different approach for each party leader. Like, I think Carney did have a couple bad days in French. There's no denying that. I think he'll still be hounded by the Bloc Québécois in that province for competition for seats. And I think there'll still be questions around Brookfield and the conflicts of interest. So we'll see how that plays out in Quebec, along with, not attending the debate and some other flubs that have happened there. Ontario will be a big battlefield. The West, the Conservatives hold on to, will try to be as competitive as possible in Ontario, and then it'll come down to, potentially a three-way split in BC. And for the NDP, I think it's a little tough right now. Maybe things can shift, and good God, I hope they do.
Okay, well, let's see if God is actually. Okay, Susan, because I know you're dying to get in.
Cole talked about province to province. Let's talk about Danielle Smith going down to speak to a far-right group, fundraising for a far-right group, and telling Breitbart News that Pierre is in sync with Donald Trump. That's not going to help Mr. Poilievre in his campaign going forward. Doug Ford clearly, and the Conservatives of Ontario, clearly do not favor a Poilievre government. Mr. Legault in Quebec is neutral. Scott Moe is blue, as blue he can be. That's not going to change. But Mr. Poilievre has some challenges across the country. Mr. Singh's challenge is to get people to see him as someone who can stand up to Trump. I still respectfully don't believe he's really in that conversation. It's between Carney and Trump. But Mr. Carney is talking about the things that are keeping people up at night, and they are connected to, the big picture issue on tariffs and trade actually connect to people's kitchen tables as well. If they lose their jobs because of tariffs, or there's a mitigation measure, that's what the Liberals and Mr. Carney's been putting forward. Poilievre has to do a significant pivot. There's a new book about him. It's called Ripper, and the book Mr. Carney has put out last year is called Values. That really shows you the narrative that's been there. It's going to be difficult for Mr. Poilievre to pivot.
Okay, George, I don't know if the United Front is even possible based on those answers, but is a Team Canada approach possible in this campaign, or is it going to necessarily be divisive?
Well, I think that is the challenge. I think at some point there's probably room for some kind of like all the parties to come together if we can do that. I don't think that is really in Pierre Poilievre's style or in his experience, but maybe he'll get desperate enough and give it a whirl, and I think that would be good. I think how do you run a campaign these days? I think I keep going back to the campaign that I worked on, but it's because you see Oshawa on TV these days, right? And so you have to talk to people, again, not even at 30,000 feet, like right on the line where, literally that's where Jagmeet is today, where folks are getting off shift in Windsor. These people, for the second time in a month and a bit, they're being threatened with maybe losing their jobs in days. And that's over 100,000 people we're talking about across this country, and that's just that's the first run through. So, these people are scared. We need to figure out ways to make sure we can actually support them. We need to set up immediately, like make sure EI is there to have their back, make sure that we actually have some plans in the short term, not just the longer term. Yes, we can have, build cars here in Canada forever.
But they're there. The EI measures have been put in place. The job sharing measures have been put in place.
Well, we just need it's more than, we need more than just the half that the EI does. We're going to have to really make sure we have people's backs, because otherwise we're going to be defaulting on mortgages, and it's going to be really, really, really hard times for a lot of people across this country.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's any illusion as how difficult this will be when the tariffs actually do come down in whatever form. But listen, I appreciate the conversation this evening. Cole, Susan, George, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.